Walter Grady, 66, had become a fixture of the Brooklyn streets, always seen, never truly noticed. He kept mostly to himself, a thin, weathered man wrapped in layers of second-hand coats and silence. A battered military-style backpack clung to his shoulders, its green canvas faded from sun and years of use. He moved with the quiet rhythm of someone who had long stopped expecting life to give anything back. He collected cans in the early hours before the city stirred, careful to avoid the shouting drunks and the sweeping city trucks. If a deli clerk offered him yesterday's bagels, he'd nod, thank them softly, and take only one. Most people didn't know he had served in the U.S. Army for over 2 decades. Fewer still knew that he had been honorably discharged with commendations that once made his daughter beam with pride. But that was long ago. Long before his world narrowed to concrete and routine. What finally pushed Walter off the edge was not war. Not poverty. Not even age. It was Margaret. She had been his wife for 27 years. They met in Fort Benning when she volunteered at the base library. She smiled with her whole face, and when he returned from his first deployment, she was waiting with a casserole and a ring. When cancer came in 2008, Walter did everything the doctors asked. But the diagnosis from the VA had come too late. It spread. She suffered. And then she was gone. After the funeral, Walter withdrew from everyone, family, neighbors, even himself. He sold their modest apartment in Queens, donated the money to her favorite hospice charity, and disappeared. The military pension went unclaimed. His phone was left at a bus stop. By the time his niece filed a missing person report, he had already melted into the margins. To Walter, it wasn't that he didn't want help. It was that he didn't believe he deserved it. Margaret had trusted the system. He had trusted the system. And it failed her. So he chose a different kind of service, one of solitude, of quiet penance, of vanishing. On most days, he survived with grim consistency. But by November, the air had **N to bite harder. That week had brought cold rains, wind that cut under doorways, and a drop in temperatures that pushed even the strongest to shelter. Walter had not eaten in nearly 3 days. His coat was soaked from sleeping under an awning. His gloves, once military issue, had holes in the fingers. He still carried the habit of counting calories like rations. That afternoon, he passed Morelli's Corner Market, a small neighborhood grocery with tight aisles and fading linoleum tiles. He had stood outside the store twice already that day, debating. His stomach hurt in that particular way hunger begins to feel like heat. Just enough to blur judgment. Inside, the familiar hum of a small heater and the scent of fruit slightly past its prime gave him pause. He made his way toward the bread aisle, his footsteps slow, deliberate. He saw a loaf, sliced white bread, marked down, nearing expiration. The kind Margaret used to toast with a little butter and cinnamon on Sunday mornings. The memory, vivid and cruel, pushed him forward. When Mr. Morelli turned to help another customer, Walter reached out with trembling fingers and slid the loaf into his coat. He zipped it halfway, not quick enough. "Hey! Stop right there!" Mr. Morelli shouted, eyes narrowing. "I'm calling the cops." Walter didn't move. He simply stood there, bread still visible, his coat half-zipped, expression calm in a way that unsettled everyone around him. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't ashamed. "I just needed strength to live one more day," he said. 2 patrol officers arrived within minutes. One was young, the other older with a clipboard and the expression of a man on his 10th petty theft call of the week. They looked Walter over, his gaunt frame, his wet clothes, the dog tags around his neck. "You really a vet?" Officer Jenkins asked quietly, examining the rusted ID tag. Walter nodded. "I used to be someone useful." "Not anymore." "You know the store's pressing charges?" "Yes," Walter replied. There was no malice in his tone. No defense. Just a tired surrender. Jenkins hesitated, then gently placed the cuffs around Walter's thin wrists. "Sorry, sir. I don't have a choice." Walter nodded again, and they led him outside. At the precinct, Walter was processed without incident. He sat on a cold bench for hours, his back against the wall, watching as one intoxicated man shouted and another wept into his palms. He said nothing. When his public defender arrived, she gave him 7 minutes, her speech fast and rehearsed. She offered a plea deal he didn't understand, then moved on to the next folder. His court date was set for the next morning. That night in the holding cell was colder than the street. Walter was given a blanket so thin it felt like a memory of warmth. He sat under the flickering fluorescent light, his eyes half closed. Around midnight, another man in the cell began cursing loudly in his sleep. A guard shouted. Someone kicked a wall. Walter just sat quietly, remembering the desert wind in Iraq, the sound of Margaret humming in the kitchen, and the loaf of bread that now sat in an evidence bag. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine how she would have handled this. She would have been furious at him. And then, probably, brought him soup. Morning arrived without grace. Walter was given a stale muffin and led to a transport van, wrists in cuffs once again. The ride to the courthouse was short, but the city looked different through the barred window. Colder. Hungrier. In the courtroom, Walter stood alone. No family. No friends. Just lawyers with overstuffed folders and staff too bored to notice the man who had once driven a burning truck away from a convoy ambush. They didn't know. He didn't tell them. Case number 47293. State versus Walter Grady, the clerk read. The judge barely looked up. The prosecutor stood, tie slightly askew, and delivered a clinical summary of Walter's theft, prior incidents, no fixed address, risk of flight. He recommended continued detention until trial. Mr. Grady, the judge asked, how do you plead? Walter straightened, raised his head. Guilty, Your Honor. A small laugh came from someone in the gallery. The judge **TA glare at the room, then looked back down at the file. And then, his hand froze on the page. Walter Edward Grady, he read aloud. Former Staff Sergeant. U.S. Army. Something changed in the judge's face. His fingers gripped the edge of the bench. His breath caught for half a second. The courtroom had grown suddenly quiet. And then, without a word of explanation, Judge Michael Carmichael stood. The bailiff's eyebrows lifted. The stenographer blinked. Judges don't stand during routine arraignments. But this one did. Court will take a 15-minute recess, the judge said. His voice was hoarse. Almost shaken. The defendant will remain. And then he walked out, file still in hand, down the hall toward his chambers. Walter sat, unmoved. He had no idea what had just shifted. But something had. Something he hadn't expected in years. Someone had remembered his name. Walter was given a room that night. It wasn't much, just a converted unit in a veteran housing center near Crown Heights. The walls were blank. The bed had sharp corners and sheets that smelled faintly of bleach. But it was warm, and it had a door that locked. For the first time in years, he slept indoors. He didn't sleep well, though. His body was too used to listening, to the wind, to footsteps, to sirens. But around 3 a.m., he woke to stillness. The silence was heavy, unfamiliar. He sat upright in the bed, breath fogging the window, and stared at the dog tags resting on the table. In the morning, a social worker named Melanie brought him coffee in forms. She moved gently, as if understanding the fragility of a man who hadn't filled out paperwork in over a decade. She asked if he had any family. He shook his head. She didn't push. Word of his courtroom moment had started to spread. A reporter had been in the back, originally assigned to cover a Dr*G trafficking case. But Walter's story, an old soldier, a loaf of bread, and a judge who remembered, was too human to ignore. By the end of the day, it was trending under the headline, From the Streets to Salute, Judge Frees Veteran After Learning the Truth. By the next morning, Walter's photo was on the front page of the Brooklyn Post. A younger man in a VA office in Manhattan printed it and taped it to the wall. A woman in Denver read it aloud to her father, a retired major who hadn't spoken much since his stroke. Across the country, veterans saw in Walter the reflection of their own invisible struggle, service rendered, sacrifice forgotten. The article triggered more than sympathy. It triggered outrage. Within 48 hours, the mayor's office issued a statement promising a full review of support systems for homeless veterans. A local councilwoman proposed a bill requiring the city to audit its VA coordination and emergency housing programs. The VA hotline received a spike in calls, not just from struggling veterans, but from people asking how to help. And in the quiet corners of the city, people began talking. Did you hear what happened to that vet? That judge did something real. About time someone stood up. At Morelli's Corner Market, the owner watched the news report with his arms crossed. He hadn't known. He saw only a thief that day, not a man with a Bronze Star. The next morning, he taped a sign to his window, "Free coffee for veterans." No questions asked. Walter didn't know any of this. He simply walked the neighborhood. Slowly. Cautiously. Getting used to clean socks and predictable meals. He kept mostly to himself, speaking in short phrases, answering questions with nods. But he always carried a notebook, something the housing center had given him for appointments. On the third day, he began to write in it. Just a sentence at first. Margaret would have hated this attention. Then another. I dreamed of the convoy last night. Still remember the taste of metal in my mouth. By the end of the week, he had filled 10 pages. Meanwhile, Judge Carmichael was not finished. He contacted the Veteran Affairs Committee and offered public testimony. His voice shook as he described the courtroom moment that changed him, the file, the photo, the shame. He read part of Walter's military citation into the record. He ended with one sentence. If a country can forget a man like Walter Grady, then we are forgetting ourselves. The hearing was broadcast nationally. A senator from Pennsylvania asked for the transcript. A retired general sent a handwritten note to Walter through the court clerk. It read simply, "You carried my nephew to safety. I owe you more than thanks." Walter didn't respond. But he folded the note and placed it inside the notebook. Back at the housing center, something unusual happened the following Friday. A young man stood at the front desk, holding a newspaper and asking to speak with Walter Grady. His name was Darren. He looked nervous, dressed in slacks too short for his legs, and held a plastic bag containing a framed photo. When Walter met him, the young man extended the photo. "My mom," he said. "Margaret was her aunt. You're my great-uncle. I didn't know if you were still alive." Walter stared at the image. Margaret, young, smiling, holding a baby on a picnic blanket. His voice caught. Darren explained he had found Walter's name mentioned in the obituary and remembered the stories. He had read the article and recognized the name. Walter said nothing for a long time. Then he gestured for Darren to sit. They drank coffee in silence, the photo between them. Later that evening, Walter took out his notebook and wrote, "Maybe the war didn't take everything. Maybe I left something behind worth finding." That night, a small ceremony was held at the local American Legion Hall. Someone from the mayor's office attended. There were no cameras. No microphones. Just 30 people, mostly veterans, gathered in folding chairs. They presented Walter with a plaque. It read, "In honor of Walter Grady, for duty, courage, and quiet strength." Walter didn't speak. He just held the plaque and nodded once. A slow, quiet tear slid down his cheek. Because sometimes, the world remembers. Even if it takes too long. In his chambers, Judge Carmichael locked the door behind him and placed the file gently on his desk. His hands trembled as he opened the drawer beneath a stack of legal briefs and pulled out a worn photo. The edges were curled, the image slightly faded. A group of soldiers stood in desert fatigues, boots thick with sand. Most were smiling, their arms thrown around one another, a moment of fleeting peace between missions. He scanned the back row. And there he was. Staff Sergeant Walter Grady. Broad-shouldered then. Younger, stronger. His expression was serious, the kind of serious that steadies a unit under fire. Behind him stood a tent bearing the 82nd Airborne insignia. It had been taken in Iraq, 2003. Michael Carmichael's eyes locked on a younger version of himself, barely 24, positioned 2 rows down. His arm was in a sling. The judge leaned back and exhaled. For years, he had tried not to remember Fallujah. The heat, the smoke, the screaming chaos of an ambush gone wrong. He had been a medic then, fresh from training. When the supply convoy took fire, Michael had frozen. A round tore into his shoulder. He'd fallen between vehicles. He remembered the blood, the sand in his teeth, the acrid stench of diesel. What he remembered most, though, was the voice that pulled him up. Walter. Grady had carried him 2 miles on foot, under fire, to the evac zone. He'd refused morphine until Michael was safely inside the transport. He'd gone back twice for others. 17 men had survived that day. The mission report had been buried under years of paperwork, but Michael had never forgotten. He just didn't know that the man who saved his life had ended up lost in the streets of the very country he fought for. Until now. He pulled up the federal military database, typing with urgency. The record confirmed it all: Bronze Star with valor, multiple deployments, honorable discharge. No pension collected since 2009. No known address. A final note: family contact declined. Status: inactive. He whispered aloud to the empty room, the name like a bell struck softly. Walter Grady. Back in the courtroom, Walter waited. Shackled to a chair. His head bowed. The air was stale. No one knew what the delay was. The public defender glanced at the clock. The prosecutor whispered to his assistant. A court officer checked his phone. 15 minutes stretched into 20. Then the door to chambers opened. Judge Carmichael returned. His steps were slower. His gaze heavier. He sat down. Looked at Walter. Really looked at him. Mr. Grady, he said, voice steady now. Do you remember Fallujah, June 2003? Walter blinked. He raised his head. Yes, Your Honor. The judge took a breath. You carried me 2 miles through enemy fire. You saved my life. A quiet murmur passed through the gallery. Walter did not respond. His eyes remained steady, but something in his posture softened. A slight nod. The barest movement of acknowledgement. I owe you my life, the judge continued. And this country owes you more than a cell and a criminal record for being hungry. He turned to the court officers. Remove the restraints. Walter's hands were freed. He rubbed his wrists slowly, as if unsure he'd heard correctly. The judge addressed the room. This man is not a thief. He is a soldier who was failed by every system designed to protect him. Medical. Legal. Social. He served his country with honor. And we let him disappear. He turned to the prosecutor. Case dismissed. Immediate release. There was silence. Then the sound of a gavel falling. And just like that, Walter Grady was free. But the moment did not end there. The judge stood once more. I want the court record amended. I want this case file sealed. And I want the Veteran Services Bureau contacted before this man leaves the building. He walked down from the bench. The gallery watched, unmoving, as the judge approached Walter. Slowly. Respectfully. And then, in a gesture more powerful than any verdict, Judge Carmichael saluted. Walter did not return it at first. It had been years since his hand had risen like that. But he did. One slow, deliberate salute. A single tear slipped down the judge's cheek. The bailiff lowered his head. And the court, that had once mocked, now sat in silence. The kind of silence that says more than words ever could. Outside, the sky was cold and gray. Walter exited the courthouse wearing a donated coat, the same battered backpack slung over his shoulder. But something had shifted. Something invisible, yet unmistakable. A few feet away, a woman from the Veteran Outreach Program waited with hot coffee and a clipboard. A social worker stood beside her, holding an envelope marked Emergency Assistance, Housing. Walter hesitated. Then, slowly, he stepped toward them. Not because he wanted pity, but because, for the first time in years, he believed someone might see him not as a burden, but as a man worth helping. Behind him, Judge Carmichael remained on the courthouse steps, watching in silence. Because sometimes, justice doesn't come from the law. It comes from remembering who we were before we forgot who they are.